Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Chandrika Mittal. I'm the Director of Renewable Energy Financing here at the IPA. We've been hosting a series of these workshops on the post-award index rec process. This is the last workshop in that series. It's our last and fifth workshop. So thank you for joining. I know we have potentially lower attendance given the post-Thanksgiving holiday week earlier. So I will discuss a little bit that you've heard in the past on what this workshop is about, why are we holding them, a little bit about the format of the workshop, and then we get into the content of the workshop, which is the key challenges that we've heard over the past four workshops and some of the proposals that the IPA has on these challenges. Again, this workshop is going to be informal and discussion based, so please feel free to pause me and give your input. This is by no means set in stone. They are proposed solutions. So if there are alternative ideas, we would absolutely welcome them and love to hear them. So I do want to kick off with saying I'm joined by a few other folks here at the IPA and NERA Economic Consulting, which is our procurement administrator that runs the index rec procurement. The process that we're holding right now is separate from the parallel index rec fall procurement that's going on. We will let you know if any of the agendas that we discuss are going to be implemented, and there will be separate announcements. So whatever we're discussing right now is purely for the workshop process, and none of it will be implemented in the actual procurement unless we make an announcement saying it will be. So this is a completely separate process. Why are we holding these workshops? Again, we received a lot of feedback during the pandemic and post-pandemic environment that there were extreme inflationary factors affecting the price or the strike price that people bid into our procurement. And by the time between when the contract is awarded and the project starts construction, it could be several years. And the price that they initially bid into the procurement may no longer be economic for that project to move forward. Currently, there's no process to go back and either alter your bid price or request for any type of change. So most developers that were in that bucket had to go ahead and terminate their contract. We as a state want to encourage more renewable development to meet our RPS goals. So that's ultimately not what we wanted or what the developer wants. So we are trying to explore how best we can address some of these challenges that you as developers and generators face when bidding into our procurements. During this workshop process, we also heard some other areas of improvement regarding our index rec contracts or the process overall. And while the focus of this workshop is strictly on post-award pieces, we do want to be open on all of the challenges that you guys face, whether we can implement it through this post-award process or through a long-term plan or encourage some legislative change. We are here to hear all of those challenges, but how we implement them may not always be through this post-award process. But we do want to address those and work towards those. Like I said, we are working towards the same goal to bring more renewables online. The information that you share during this workshop is what will form the basis for our compliance filing with the ICC, which is the goal of these workshops, that if we do have a path forward for changing some of the steps in this index rec procurement process, then we will file a compliance filing with the ICC in mid-February of 2025. And whatever you share during this workshop will be the basis of that compliance filing. It is how we're able to make the case and present the case to ICC that these are the issues that our participants and stakeholders are facing, and hence we want to resolve them or work towards resolving them. I do want to highlight again, there is an option to submit confidential feedback. We did get a lot of feedback in the beginning of this process that some of the content that we need you to discuss and share might be commercially sensitive, and competitive for you all. So there is an option to submit confidential feedback if you do not feel comfortable bringing it forward during the workshop. In terms of logistics, like the rest of the workshops, I want this to be an open dialogue as we want to address the challenges you're facing. So if we don't hear the challenges, it will be very hard for us to address them. Tori, can you scroll downwards a little, please? Thank you. I will pause really quickly if there are any questions or anything at this moment. If not, we'll go ahead and talk about the content of this current workshop. Okay. So over the past 4 workshops, we heard what we bucketed as 5 main challenges. Most of the feedback that we seemed to be hearing were in one of these buckets, and we are proposing some solutions to these key challenges. We don't have solutions to everything. So while we are still in this workshop process, we would love to hear if you all have any other comments or feedback on what you think the right solution might be to address that particular challenge. Now, if we did miss any of the challenges that doesn't fit in any of these 5 buckets, please feel free to bring that forward, as we want to make sure we're addressing everything that we can in this process. I do want to highlight that another avenue for bringing up index rec related or contract related challenges is also whenever the index rec procurement process begins. So we have 2 procurements every year, one in spring and one in the fall. Primarily, before that procurement process starts, NERA puts out all of the documents along with the contract for that specific procurement. And NERA always welcomes stakeholder feedback on those contracts or on the process. So if you feel that some of your comments are very strictly related to the contract that have not been resolved, that would be another great place to provide your feedback on that index specific contract. So 5 key challenges, or the buckets of challenges. The number 1 we heard is why we're here, which is the inflationary environment that we have been in between the post-award or the award of the contract and when the project starts construction. There's usually inflation on a lot of the costs behind this project. I will parallelly discuss some of the solutions in each of the buckets. So if there is anything that I'm missing, please feel free to stop me. So a key solution that we found for this inflation challenge is, like we presented in the 3rd workshop, was to bring in what we see the other states doing and proposing an inflation adjustment mechanism. I will go into the details, but I just want to introduce the key challenges and the solutions right now. The next one we heard was on the rec quantity adjustment. Currently, there's no way for developers to bid in a certain amount of recs and then to go back and change it. The key challenge that we heard when you don't have the ability to change the rec quantity you're bidding in is you all mentioned that there's usually changes in land size after you're awarded the contract, or potential changes in project size resulting in changes in rec quantities due to interconnection and transmission upgrades. So one solution that we are proposing is potentially to allow for a very strict contract term change. If your project is facing any of these 2 specific challenges and you want to modify the rec quantities you're bidding in, we want to explore the ability to change that specific contract term only as an addendum. The next challenge we heard is the interconnection and transmission upgrade costs. So we heard from some of you saying that when you submit the bid, you have a rough idea of what your transmission interconnection costs will be, but it's not until later in the process, until you get your interconnection agreement signed, that you have a full picture of what that cost would be. This was the trickiest one for us to propose any solutions. So this will be the one I want to put out for a lot of discussion if possible. We could contemplate either a bid adjustment, which would be a price change, some sort of rebidding mechanism once you're further along in your contracting process, or sorry, when you're further along in your construction process. And then last is if we want to think about introducing advanced maturity requirements, which is what we've seen a lot of the other states do, is projects need to have kind of their pillars of contracts in place. So you need to have your site control, your interconnect, and a couple other things. This is what we've seen for a lot of the other states, which are more advanced maturity requirements than what we have currently. And I want to explore if that could be a potential solution. Next, we heard a lot about the REC shortfall amounts, and I think this is something which bled into from this process, and we heard the same feedback, like I said, in our index REC procurement. So when we went out with the fall procurement materials, especially the index REC contract, we saw some of the feedback that we were receiving in the workshops, and we saw similar feedback on that index REC contract. So we did implement increased shortfall amounts via that contract feedback process. And I'll pull in Ben when we discuss this particular point to highlight some of those flexibilities that have already been added in the fall procurement and going forward. The last thing we heard about was the RPS budget, or the possibility of an RPS budget deficit. I do want to highlight that we went ahead and put together an RPS budget memo, which we committed to doing in our long-term plan, which are quarterly updates to our RPS budget, so everyone has a clear picture where we stand. We also pulled Anthony Starr, who is currently a senior advisor here at the IPA, and he presented the latest updates on the RPS budget. And I do want to say that while this is a very important topic for all of us, especially for all of you bidding, I think it's best if we keep this update either through the RPS budget memo updates or through the next long-term plan that we'll start working on in the summer of 2025. RPS budget, while I realize it's really important, it is not necessarily something we can the changes are not necessarily something we can implement through this post-award process. So giving a quick highlight, I do want to go back to the first agenda topic, which was the post-award inflation. We heard challenges on that. We talked about some solutions. And what we are leaning towards is implementing an optional inflation adjustment mechanism. We don't have a full understanding of what that may look like, so we absolutely are open to feedback, but our closest comparison is to what New York has for their land-based renewables. We currently saw that they have a very generic formula. We saw that in workshop number 3. A lot of you commented that that formula may not be something that captures everything you need it to capture. So I do want to pause and see if there's any feedback about us potentially including an optional inflation adjustment mechanism. I am very open to it. Like I said, we don't have a formula nailed down. That will be our process. Once we wrap up the workshops and put together a summary of our compliance filing, the idea is to just enlist the changes that we want to see. And then this will be a longer term process where we want to make sure we're analyzing everything that needs to be analyzed before we put together a formula for the specific inflation adjustment mechanism. So I do want to pause and see if there are any reactions, if you guys think it is a good idea to have an optional inflation adjustment mechanism, or if there are other better tools out there that we may not have explored. Yes, Elizabeth.
Thanks. Thanks for that overview, Chandrika. I really appreciated the organization of your thinking on this and the transparency on it. As for the inflation, the optional inflation adjustment mechanism, I have a couple of reactions and thoughts. The first one is Clean Grid Alliance supports coming up with an inflation adjustment mechanism. We think that there are some very workable formulas that are either already out there or could be adjusted to be workable based on what's already out there. And one thing that I was looking at recently was actually the New York um, system has a more complicated but potentially adaptable formula for its offshore wind adjustment. That goes into a little bit more specifics about the component prices and the inflation metrics. And I was wondering if you guys had looked at that at all and maybe doing some tweaks to make it more appropriate for the Illinois process. And then the second thought I had on this process overall is that I think we have some concern about kicking the nailing down of the specific formula to beyond February when the ICC filing is due. That if there's some way that we could have in sort of a draft and comment opportunity, a draft formula, see if we can nail it down. And if you guys would all be open to actually just going ahead and including that in the February filing so that it can be effective sooner.
Sure. So I want to respond to your first question, which was, have we looked at the New York offshore formula? Yes, absolutely. We looked at all the inflation adjustment mechanisms that are active today, and that was mostly in the northeastern states as we explored together in workshop number 3. The offshore formulas, as we've noticed, were really advanced and potentially complicated, which is great when you want to handle the nuances. The key challenge that we face, and we are talking to New York as well, is for land-based renewables, ideally we wanted one formula to tackle both solar and wind, so we don't get into a lot of nuances and keep it simple. For offshore wind, the reason a lot of the states could go deeper was because you were only trying to tackle wind. Whereas if we try to do inflation adjustment, we'll be trying to tackle wind, solar, and potentially even hydro, given those are the 3 procurements we handle through this procurement method. I think we are open to everything at this point. We are open to exploring 2 different formulas, maybe one for wind, one for solar, and have very specific either component pricing. I remember seeing component pricing, labor pricing, and then generalized inflation and having different weightings for all of these items, potentially even steel and some of the other components. I think we're open to it. I don't think we are thinking to limit us to what we've seen in New York, because like I said, we've been talking to New York and even they've received feedback on their land-based renewables formula for it to be more advanced. So we are absolutely open to it. I just don't know if that's the best until we go into that deep dive analysis of what are the pros and cons of having a simplistic or generic formula versus a very involved technology specific formula. As for implementing or putting something in the compliance filing, what I'm hearing is the main reason we want to see that is because we want a solution quicker. And then secondly, we want an ability to provide feedback. In terms of having a solution quicker, we absolutely agree that this is a pain point and we want to work towards the same goal. But I want to balance that this is something which is drastically changing our procurements. So I want to make sure we do the due diligence to fully understand the pros and cons of implementing something like this. Especially because if you notice how it works for most of the other states is it's both inflating up and down, which means a lot of movement to our already limited RPS budget. What that means in terms of procuring future renewables versus current renewables. So until we do that deep dive, I don't know if this is something we can implement that quickly. But as far as feedback is concerned, we absolutely want this to be a transparent process. And we want to ensure that if we were to introduce a mechanism like this, I'm pretty sure we will have some sort of stakeholder feedback on the formula, on the process, and then only move forward. I don't expect it to be, oh, we floated the idea and now here's the final formula. I think this will absolutely involve and need stakeholder feedback so we can come up with something that works for everyone, because the main reason to do this is because we want it to work for you. So if we do have ample opportunity for stakeholder feedback as we develop this formula, do you still feel the need for it to be in February? Because if I'm being completely honest, that seems quite difficult to achieve on such a short timeline, especially with everyone's holiday schedules. And I want to give it the due diligence to hold multiple stakeholder feedback sessions for the formula alone.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I guess just as quickly as possible.
Absolutely.
Our
Yes.
ask.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I understand that. I don't want this to feel like this is your last shot to provide feedback and then the formula will be implemented. It will absolutely be an involved process, and we'll engage all stakeholders at every step of that development to ensure that this is something that works for everyone.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Any other feedbacks or reactions to the inflation adjustment mechanism or the introduction of potential inflation adjustment mechanism?
Yeah. Hey, Chandrika. Yeah, I don't have anything to add for what Elizabeth said, but I'll just mention that we kind of agree with everything that she had laid out. Um, you know, I think the NYSERDA optional, inflation adjustment mechanism is a little bit too simplistic, like you said, and doesn't really capture um, everything as a whole. I don't believe we didn't, we have a couple projects in New York and we didn't end up opting into that formula. I'm not sure if any other developers did, but we'd definitely be open to providing any kind of feedback on a process, trying to figure out a more complicated formula, but making it as simple as possible. So yeah, really nothing else to add, just that we agree with everything that Elizabeth had mentioned.
Awesome. If you don't mind, a quick question back to you, Billy. If you feel comfortable sharing why, I guess you or other developers are choosing not to opt in, would you be able to highlight at a very high level?
Yeah, I think there's just I think it comes down to equipment pricing just not being fully captured, and at least this first formula that they had come up with, it's based on the, I forget the metric off the top of my head, but it's a very simple inflationary metric that doesn't really capture all of the changes with the supply chain and the ripple effect from COVID and everything. So I think just from a more like it was just more simplistic for us to bid a price that we were comfortable with, and that is going to be our price. With that specific project, it was a lot further along in development, so we were much more confident with the price. I think that also had to do with it, but mainly due to that formula not capturing equipment costs really.
Gotcha. So what I'm hearing is potentially people are not opting in, or you didn't opt in because the formula didn't address the challenge that it was hoping to address.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate that feedback. That's really helpful for us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Of course. Anyone else on any feedback on the inflation adjustment mechanism? Okay, if not, I do want to address one key point that I have here for this mechanism and clarify that at this point, we don't think this would be a retroactive change. So when it gets implemented, it will be for contracts for that procurement and going forward. The reason for not implementing retroactively is when we try to assess how the formula truly works and about the contracts that were already bid in without the option for inflation adjustment, we think it may count as potential gaming and even double dipping, as most developers currently bid in or price in some level of inflation in their existing bid price without the option to opt into an inflation adjustment mechanism. So if we look at past bids, we expect that they have already priced in some level of inflation. And then if we were to provide the opportunity retroactively to opt into inflation adjustment, it could be potential double dipping and could be a scenario for gaming, which is why at this point we think this would be a change that would only impact contracts for that particular procurement when it's implemented and going forward. Is there any feedback on that note? Yes, Elizabeth.
Happy to let others jump in before me too, but I was wondering if IPA has given any thought to maybe a bifurcated approach where existing contracts could have the opportunity to have a one-time adjustment based on inflation that maybe takes into account some of that, what you talked about, already existing inflation that may be incorporated into bids. The worry is that we're already facing a big challenge with getting these existing contracts built. And I think if this is not available to contracts that are already existing, there's a real possibility that you're going to see a lot more of those contracts end up stranded or not fully executed.
Yeah,
thereby pushing development that Illinois is already invested in further down the road.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and I appreciate the feedback. We did think about it, and I think it'll come down to when it finally gets implemented and how many projects or contracts are kind of in that state. Again, if I were to think down this line, it would probably involve a lot of open book discussions in terms of what exactly is the margin you've incorporated in every step of the development cycle for this bid price, and then kind of back working or maybe having some sort of lower ceiling or some sort of caps on the actual adjustment mechanism that gets implemented for everyone else. It pretty much will be potentially a one-off situation just for those projects that are in that boat at that moment. And honestly, it seems there will be a lot of questions for stakeholders whose projects weren't in that boat, in terms of, let's say, if we say, oh, the cap is 15% for everyone else, but only 10% for these projects because they've already baked in, let's say, 5%, or because they go open book and they tell us we baked in this level. It, to me, seems ripe for a lot of disgruntled stakeholders saying, how did you decide to do this? Why is this applicable? Why does it make sense to do 10% and not 5% inflation adjustment? So it just seems very ripe for that kind of loop. I'm not sure. Again, once we look at how many projects are in that boat, we could do that, but I'm not sure if investing the time and resources to hold a one-off almost adjustment makes sense, again, given how many projects might be in that boat. So heard you want to consider it, but I'm not sure where that would stand because I don't know when this will be implemented and how many projects might be in that boat.
Yeah, I think those are all very fair considerations. It's just something that I know a lot of our members are interested in pursuing given the status of their existing contracts with the IPA, and it might be worth doing some, as you noted, data analysis on what it would take, what it would mean for all of those contracts that are in limbo to ultimately be abandoned, and what it would take to come up with a fair enough solution that everybody feels satisfied with it.
Yeah, and again, spitballing off the top of my head here, but potentially could also look at those projects if they're already, let's say, if they were competitive in past procurement and they're already a step ahead, they have clear line of sight of their pricing at this point, then they could potentially rebid because our procurements happen so often. It wouldn't be a huge delay by any means. I can't imagine it being more than 4 or 5 months delayed, given that's how often the procurements are held. So it could be one solution where we encourage them with maybe lowered collateral penalty or something on those lines to look at potentially just encouraging rebidding if the change in price is that significant for them. So there are a lot of options, and I do understand there will be projects that will be in limbo, but I am not sure if, again, conducting a one-off process and investing the resources for that would be worth it unless there are a huge number of megawatts at stake, and then maybe we will be talking differently. Any other feedback on the first challenge regarding inflation and the inflation adjustment mechanism? Okay. Hearing none, and I don't see any hands raised. Let's jump into the second challenge we heard, which is currently, and I do want to clarify because there is some potentially confusing language in the process. Currently we allow for projects to change their project size. So if you bid in a certain megawatt project, we allow you to change the size of the project to whatever degree you want. What we don't allow when you put in your bid is the number of RECs you're committing to us from that project and the price you're putting in for that number of RECs into that project. So we heard feedback about the REC quantity adjustment, not necessarily just the size. The feedback was related to that stakeholders wanted the ability to change the number of RECs that they bid into the initial procurement. The reason for requesting the ability to change these REC quantities was listed as two main. One, we heard that a lot of stakeholders see a change in land size where their project will be located, resulting in a smaller project size and resulting in smaller REC quantities or the RECs that the project will be generating. So they wanted the ability to change the number of RECs because the land size in the project has changed. The second request was to change the number of REC quantities bid in due to changes in interconnection and transmission upgrades. What we understand from that is if the interconnection costs, which often can be tied to your size of your project, are too high, we believe some stakeholders, developers, reduce the project size, thereby reducing the number of REC quantities that they want to bid into the procurement. We are open and exploring a possible contract term change only for the REC quantities, so only one contract term you would be allowed to change, and you may be allowed to update the number of REC quantities you're bidding into the procurement based on these two changes in your project, which would be changes in the land size and changes in project size or REC quantities due to interconnection and transmission. Those were the key challenges that we heard. So those are the key changes we are contemplating allowing. If there are any other changes or feedback on how stakeholders feel on this particular solution, we are all ears. Any reactions, if that's a welcome change or a change not valued or a change that doesn't seem to significantly affect your projects?
Hey, this is Elizabeth. Our members support that.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, sounds like it's potentially a welcome change. Okay, this is the trickiest one and the one I don't have a lot of answers to, but I'm hoping to get feedback on, is we heard that obviously when developers bid into a procurement right now, we do not require a GIA, we do not require an interconnection agreement. So what we've seen happen and we've heard happen is when developers bid into the procurement, they have an estimate for what the interconnection and transmission costs would be. But by the time the contract is executed, the interconnection agreement is executed, those costs may significantly change. And currently, there's no way to go back and either alter your bid price because you have suddenly increased interconnection or transmission costs. So your only option is to either absorb it or terminate and potentially rebid in the next procurement. Some of the solutions that we talked about internally is allowing for a possible bid adjustment only based on interconnection and transmission, which would mean that we will have to ask for a lot of initial data that we do not ask for currently around what is your interconnection estimate? Why is it that? At what point does it change? At what size of the project does it change? And then potentially get into the cost benefit of analysis of keeping a project size a certain size or changing that. Which is possibly what would entail if we were to allow people to come back and alter their bid. This also is ripe for a lot of questions on how is the new bid price the best price, and we understand that. So alternatively, we could consider rebidding, which is you bid in the next procurement, which is usually only a few months away, with the insight that you have now with your updated costs, and we could potentially talk about looking at some of the damage that's caused due to this from collateral that you've put into the project already, or collateral that you've submitted to us for the project already. Another option that we talked about internally, which seems the cleanest, but there are pros and cons in terms of requiring an advanced maturity for the projects that are bid into the procurement. So like I talked about initially, a lot of the other states require that projects have an interconnection agreement, primarily because that does give a clear line of sight of what those interconnection and transmission costs can be, and let the developers decide if it's worth it to build the project with those costs before they enter the procurement. So this is the one where I would welcome any feedback that you have on two lines. One, if this transmission and interconnection upgrade costs are truly a pain point. And if yes, then what are your thoughts on having one of these three options implemented? Or if you have a fourth or another option that we have not considered, please bring it forward. I do know that Apex potentially raised this issue initially, so I was curious if they had any suggestions, but I'm not sure if they're here today. If there are no recommendations, at least it would be helpful to understand how big of a challenge is this interconnection and transmission cost upgrades. Do you all already have some level baked in, or do you want the ability to change your bid or potentially rebid or have advanced maturity? I see Alejandro, yes.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So I guess on this one, I probably have more questions and unfortunately no proposals. I think you raised this when you talked about the rebidding, just in terms of, thinking about someone pulling out of a previously awarded contract and bidding into the next procurement. How is that not a potential for gaming? And B, what are the would there be some sort of penalty associated, not the full loss of collateral, but, you know, because at the end of the day, there's some, you could potentially benefit. I mean, I think if you have a bid adjustment, that's one thing. That one's a harder one. I think that, you know, speaking without talking to everyone in our company, I think the kind of information you might be asking is something that we wouldn't want to provide at the beginning. So we'd be unlikely to take that approach, but the rebidding process seems something that could be potentially useful, but then at what cost and to your advanced maturity? Yeah, that would be, I think that could present some challenges just thinking about everything that's happening in the interconnection process right now. So just those are my thoughts.
Okay, thank you. And I think in terms of rebidding, I do want to clarify, it's not necessarily a rebidding for that particular round, but encouraging stakeholders that are facing that challenge to bid into the subsequent already scheduled procurement, which basically would be just a fresh bid going in, potentially penalties involved for I do understand estimating interconnection and transmission can be a little bit of an art, but I think the penalty would just be for not potentially having the full line of sight or to the level that you could have where you have certain assumptions baked into your bid and you need to pull out and then bid into a future subsequent procurement. So it's not necessarily rebidding for that particular round. It would be more just considering a fresh bid into the future procurement. It is interesting to hear from you about possible bid adjust, and I don't know if I understood this correctly, so I would appreciate clarity, but I think what you said was a possible bid adjustment was more of an issue, or the rebidding was more of an issue.
Well, no, the bid adjustment, I think you said that if you wanted to go down this route, right, you would ask for a lot more information about estimated interconnection costs of that nature. I think that, again, hearing it on like just first blush and before going back, that strikes me as something that wouldn't be information that we'd want to share. So I think that there'd be reluctance among some. So that seems an unlikelihood. I mean, and again, I would assume that this would be stuff that would this be able to be stuff that would be shared with you under file, or is this all for public disclosure? Because this could be something that, you know, someone has an art to this, and so revealing this kind of information might be something you would want.
Absolutely. No, heard you loud and clear on that. And while we were chatting, I'm almost thinking, what if it was similar to inflation adjustment? What if it was an optional mechanism to opt into either future rebidding with increased collateral because you don't have a full understanding of your interconnection and transmission costs or something like that, which would mean you would opt in to provide more information rather than that being the mandatory.
And understood. And then I guess the question of that is, when you were submitting your bid, would this be something that you would have to not do at your bid submission or after being selected?
It would be at bid submission. So I'm almost picturing, what if there were two options when you're submitting your bid? One would be to opt into an inflation adjustment mechanism, and one would be to opt into a potential bid adjustment or rebidding due to interconnection and transmission cost upgrades. And it would be something you opt in at the time of submitting your bid. So if you choose not to opt in, you would not be required to share more information about your project.
Okay, thank you.
Any other feedback on this as we're spitballing here? I am curious, Elizabeth, if this is something you've heard from your members on the changes in transmission and interconnection costs, and if that's been a pain point.
Generally, yes. I'm not sure that we've talked about these, you know, specific proposals for how to cure it, aside from figuring out some way to accommodate additional interconnection costs within the idea of a renegotiation process. So I don't have any specific feedback on your proposal.
Okay, but just to clarify, that is a pain point that you've heard from your members.
Yes.
Anyone else that wants to chime in on A, whether it is a pain point, and two, if you have any suggestions or possible cons to any of these solutions? I do want to ask about advanced maturity in that case, and from what Alejandro said, it sounds like obviously we know the condition of the queues in both PJM and MISO territory. I do see that a lot of the obviously other states are requiring projects to be further along. Is that something that's going to be impossible to meet at this point, given the condition in the two ISOs, or is that something, I'm just curious how far along are your projects, or how tedious would be to require a project to have an interconnect agreement to bid into the procurement? If anyone can share any light on that. I know we only ask for site control, but when you bid into the procurement, are your projects typically further along, closer to securing interconnect, or a year or so away from securing interconnect? I know it can be a little sensitive to share that information, so I don't know if Elizabeth, you have any feedback from your members around where the projects are typically in their development life cycle when they submit, given we don't ask for a lot of information right now.
No, I don't have specific knowledge of that.
Hi, this is Don Fisher with Amoresco. Yeah, we generally are in the brownfield category, so this probably doesn't apply to the utility scale projects. But yeah, we wait to at least one of the study phases, so we have a pretty good idea of the path forward before we participate.
Okay, that's great to know. Thanks, Don. Anyone else that might be willing to share how requiring potentially an interconnect agreement to bid into the procurement would impact your ability to bid into the procurement? Okay. I think that's all the feedback we are going to get on the third challenge. The next one, I will pull Ben Chi from NERA to highlight. So we heard that the REC shortfall amounts, which are allowed currently in our index REC contract, or I should say that were allowed up until the fall contract. So prior to this current procurement that's going on, we received feedback that those were too stringent. What that essentially meant was basically that the project, so if you compare to a private contract where there are some sort of performance guarantees, our current contracts didn't allow for a lot of leeway in how much you could fall short from the REC quantity that you were bidding into the procurement. So we did receive a lot of feedback on that and increase that shortfall amount through the contract feedback process. So like I mentioned, prior to every procurement, we hold a contract feedback process where most of you comment and share your feedback on that specific contract. That amount was substantially increased, and I will pull in Ben. If Ben, you can talk a little bit about what it used to be, what it is now, and what that essentially means in terms of, let's say, how much generation or RECs you could fall short on annually or overall.
Yeah. Thanks, Chandrika. Well, first of all, I would just want to thank you, Chandrika, for your very lucid summary of the pain points, potential solutions, as well as the process. I think they were very clear and very helpful just to hear with clarity what is going on. For the rest of us here, I guess Benjamin Chi here, representing the procurement administrator on behalf of the agency, just wanted to flag a few things. I think one is that there are a lot of flexibility and accommodations made in the contract, and I'll go through some of them for your benefit, but also to point out the fact, and maybe just to reiterate or repeat what Chandrika has said, is that many of these things that I'm about to mention actually were pursuant to feedback or comments from stakeholders like yourself through the contract comment process. So that is to say that, nothing needs to be resolved here in this workshop, but ongoing, every time we have a new procurement, these things are brought up and are open for your comments and your feedback. And we do take all of your comments very seriously, either in tweaking the mechanism, introducing new mechanisms, or recalibrating them based on your feedback. So in terms of what we have currently to allow for you to manage some of your delivery obligations. So when you bid into the procurement process, you're naming a bid price, and then you're also naming a quantity that you're committing to, sort of a baseline set for the delivery year requirement, or the annual quantity, or the quantity of racks that you're committing to deliver each year. So from the start, I will just mention things that will help you manage your delivery, and then I'll talk about accommodations. So some things that will help you manage the delivery year upon year for solar projects, whether it's brownfield or utility scale. We used to have a 0.5% degradation that was brought in based on supplier feedback. We have now expanded that to be a bespoke degradation rate that you can name for your solar projects. We don't ask the question, as can be between 0 to 1% year upon year for the next 20 years upon energization. So you get to name that, you get to tell us what it would be to manage your own deliveries. The second is we do allow for 241 months of acceptable vintage period. So more than 20 years of acceptable vintage. But an extra month there just to ensure you have the ability to maximize on your rack quantities over the 20-year term. And something that Chandrika mentioned earlier, I just want to repeat here, there is no prohibition in terms of size changes, in terms of what you have proposed in the RFP and what you eventually build. There's no prohibition on size changes, but we do try to ask you for your commitment in terms of the rack quantities. A close cousin to that is that there is great latitude in terms of siting of your project. We ask for a site map to help us understand where your project will be sited. But what the contract requires is at least 50% of your project must be sited within the map that you provide to us. This is great latitude in terms of, if the land, south of where your boundaries doesn't fit, you can build north of it or, east or west of that. As long as 50% of your project is within the site map that you provide us. It's just a general rule that we have. And in terms of other things that we have moved in the enhancements to allow you to accommodate shortfalls. Again, what we are looking for is the quantity that you have bid in, and the accommodations. I'll name, 2 or 3 of them here. The first is if you are short in the first stop year, as well as the first and second full delivery years, June through May constitutes a delivery year. Any shortfall that don't meet the delivery requirement in these years or time period is not counted against you. So they are not shortfall amounts, they are not shortfall years. Whatever that you deliver in the first 2 delivery years and the stop period beforehand, they are just considered for payment and settlement purposes, but there's no penalties tied to any shortfall amounts in these years. We have also expanded the terms of the quantity requirement, currently, you have to be at least short 5 or more years. And on top of that, the shortfall amounts cumulatively must exceed 2 times the annual quantity for you to trigger an event of default. So it used to be 3 or more years and 1 times the annual quantity. We have more than doubled that in this round as well. That is also through stakeholder feedback that we have done so. And if you are still short, despite all of these accommodations that I've just stated here, then there is a process for you to make a manual transfer, and as well as to make a waiver request to the IPA. So I'll talk about the manual transfer first. Manual transfers of RECs are when you have excess RECs in good years. You can always use those to reduce shortfall amounts, but also if you have RECs that are beyond what is captured in the standing order because you have committed it to some other commercial entity, you can also use those, to cover the shortfall. In terms of the waiver, it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. If an event of default has been triggered, you can make that waiver request to the IPA for good cause. And there are some examples that we have provided in the contract as well. Things like long-term weather patterns or serial defects in terms of the components. So you have to make that request if you do believe they are out of your control. In terms of other aspects that are out of your control, that are unforeseen, we have also expanded numerous times the force majeure provisions as well as the material adverse clause provisions due to government action under the contract. So I just want to note these things for you, but mainly to let you know that we do take your feedback seriously and that you should not think that this is the only place where you have the opportunity to let us know that you have pain points and for us to listen to you and to make changes accordingly. There is the ongoing contract comment process that takes place at least twice a year for you to make known to us where you think we should enhance the contract or recalibrate the requirements. So with that, Chandrika, I'll turn that back over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ben. Any questions on the flexibilities that were implemented in the fall procurement, and if there's any feedback on whether that is currently working for folks or not? We would love to hear it. I do want to highlight that what 2 times the annual quantity essentially implies or means is similar to what we see in the market, where you could technically be falling short almost 10 or 11% every year on your RECs, which is a little higher than, I guess, the performance guarantees that exist in a lot of these private bilateral contracts. So we're trying to get as close to possible as the realistic generation that you all see from your projects and to match what you think you'll be able to provide in terms of RECs based on that realistic generation. There are, like Ben pointed out, a lot of flexibilities in addition to if you face challenges that seem extreme and out of your control to put your case forward in front of the IPA and to potentially seek some additional flexibilities. But any feedback on that? Have you all looked at that new contract yet? And does it suffice to what you would expect or were hoping based on your feedback? Okay. The last one is the RPS budget, and like I mentioned in the beginning, it is something that we're acutely aware impacts everyone, especially when you go ahead to finance your projects. But like I mentioned, we are attempting to provide budget updates or RPS budget updates quarterly via the memo format. And I would encourage you to share your feedback in the next long-term plan draft when that's released in summer, fall of 2025. But I would say that I think all of us understand that this is something that we hope would be fixed legislatively, given the limited budget amount when you're trying to match a floating price is not ideal, especially with the caps that we have. Most other states do not have these sorts of caps, and that's how they deal with ensuring that the contracts are, the contractual obligations are paid out and the contracts never fall short. Most states don't have that cap requirement, which we do in Illinois. So if that is something, that you have more feedback on, please share when we put out our draft for the next long-term plan. But also we recognize and encourage for everyone to hopefully try and fix that legislatively. Those were all the challenges that we could pull out from all of the past 4 workshops. And those were our proposed solutions. If there's any other challenge that I might have missed that was raised that's not falling into any of these buckets, I would please encourage you to bring forward now. The reason to bring forward now is because these are the challenges that we'll be addressing when we file our compliance filing with the ICC. So if it is not covered in any of these, we may not be able to address it, and it won't be, and you won't see a change in the index rec process if it's not covered here. Okay, I really hope those were your key buckets, and I hope these solutions work, but by no means is this your last shot. Like I said, as we explore the adjustment mechanism and as we conduct every procurement, we encourage everyone to engage in the stakeholder feedback process. So please continue to provide us your feedback, as that's how we improve this process. Agenda number 5 were questions that were submitted. We did not have any questions submitted in advance of this workshop. So I don't have anything to address, but very importantly, what are the next steps after this last and final workshop? You can look forward to a summary of the workshop. We typically put out a recording of this workshop, a written notes summary, and the attendee list from the workshop. You can look forward to that in the next week or so. And then more importantly, we will be working to put together a draft in December, January months on our end. And that draft proposal will be released for public comment on January 20th. So in addition to seeking your feedback today, where I kind of wanted to highlight what we've talked about so far, what were the challenges, and gain your feedback. So when we do file this draft, hopefully nothing surprising comes your way. Our goal is to address all of the challenges with the possible solutions we listed today in our compliance filing. If you feel you did not have a chance to have your challenges raised or addressed, or if you vehemently disagree with any of the solutions we propose in today's workshop, you will have an opportunity to submit your feedback on that draft compliance filing or draft proposal between January 20th and February 3rd. So that will be your window to put forward your comments on that draft proposal. At which point, after February 3rd, we look to wrap up and address the comments that are submitted on the proposal. Again, I really hope that you will take the chance today to highlight anything that you feel strongly about or that we did not cover or you would like us to do differently, given the feedback process and addressing the feedback process is pretty tight. So if there are any big changes you want to see that we did not talk about or you disagree with our proposed solutions, please try and bring it up today. So public comments will be due on February 3rd, and you will see our final proposal, which will be in a docket for the compliance filing with the ICC by February 19th is when it's expected. That's pretty much what I had for today's workshop. But again, if there are any of the topics or challenges or solutions that you did not feel addresses the challenges you're facing or are not the right solutions you would like to see implemented, I encourage you to come forward and we can have a really good discussion. I do really want to hear all possible solutions and challenges. But if not, I will be sticking around for the next few minutes. If not, this will be the end of today's workshop, and you can look forward to the workshop summary in the next week or so, like I said, and then we look forward to your feedback beginning January 20th on the draft proposal we put out. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.